Asus might have gone completely mad. This is a gaming tablet. And no, it's not some cheap Android thing. Instead, this is an entire gaming laptop, but it's a tablet. Insane, I know. This is the ROG Flow Z or Z13, and it is a gaming tablet like no other. Optionally, you can spend another grand and pick this up with this other box here, which happens to be the ROG XG Mobile, a specifically RTX 3080 laptop GPU with a 150 watt TDP. There is a lot to cover with this whole thing, so let's jump right in. But first, a message from this video's sponsor, Lexar. Their Aries RGB RAM is a factory overclocked, stylish RGB kit that comes in both DDR4 and DDR5 options, plus this stunning white too. It offers impressive overclocked performance, with this kit boasting a 4000 megatransfer per second rating, plus sleek aluminium heat spreaders, and of course is topped with RGB lighting, which you can control with Lexar RGB Sync. It's even compatible with major motherboard brands' RGB platforms, so check it out at the link in the description below. This is certainly an unusual form factor, where instead of the main hardware being under the keyboard, the hardware here is all up in the sort of behind the display, leaving the keyboard to be nothing more than an RGB backlit type cover, which yes, you can remove if you want. This has some advantages. If you want to use it as a drawing tablet, then you don't have a keyboard on the back to hold on to. And of course, the more obvious one, and for us gamers that's probably more important, is airflow, because you have clean air coming in from the back of the chassis and flowing up through the top, in theory meaning better thermals. There are, however, some downsides to this design, like how despite the type cover folding with and magnetically holding itself slightly raised for a better typing feel, it has a frustrating amount of what you might call deck flex. It can flex enough to get in the way of you typing, which is already difficult thanks to this design. The Z13 does include an adjustable kickstand so that you can, well, stand or recline the tablet to most angles you could want, but the catch is that you actually need more desk or lap space to use this machine, especially with the type cover, which I think is a bit of an irony. You need to have space for both the kickstand and the keyboard, whereas on a more conventional machine you only need space for the keyboard and, you know, space to recline the screen. You're also pretty limited with in the I/O department here, with just a single Thunderbolt 4 USB-C port, a USB 2 Type A port, a headphone jack, and the XG Mobile connector, which does include a USB-C port. But seriously, Asus, a USB 2.0 port? As the only Type A here? Plus only a single Type C port, which if you're not using the XG Mobile to charge or the XG Mobile's extra I/O, you have to use that one Type C port, meaning the only spare port is a USB-A port. Like, what? Also, you will need to use that charger because the battery life here is mediocre. You get around 6 hours of sort of media playback thanks to the 56 watt-hour battery, and also just a minor nitpick, if you are using the XG Mobile, good luck getting the tiny little completely disconnected rubber sort of stopper cover off. If you don't have long fingernails, you're never getting that out, and if you do get it out, like I said, it's completely detached, so you will lose it very quickly. Still, the unique design hasn't managed to interfere with the pretty beefy hardware inside. My unit is rocking the i9-12900H with a shocking peak power limit of 95 watts, although 40 watts in its standard performance mode, plus 16 gigabytes of LPDDR5, I think 5200, at least that's what Windows reports, which is soldered RAM. You do have an RTX 3050 Ti or 3050, depending on what your which option you go for, with a peak 40 watt TDP, which is 35 watts base plus 5 watts of dynamic boost, and a 1TB PCI Gen 4 2230 M.2 drive that is user serviceable from the back, alongside a microSD card slot. although you won't find many, especially larger capacity 2230 M.2 drives, so it's likely that if you get this one, that's what you're staying with, at least for the time being. Performance from that i9-12900H is actually, well, it can be pretty remarkable. Of course, it won't hold a candle to a thicker sort of standard laptop that can cool the chip a fair bit better, but in its turbo mode, it jumped to the fastest all-core results I've seen in Cinebench R20, and actually the same for the single-threaded results as well. Although thermal throttling did catch up to it pretty quickly, as when I ran Cinebench R23 immediately after R20, it ended up being a hair slower than the 12700H in the larger and slightly better cooled ZenBook Pro Duo that I've checked out pretty recently. In its standard performance mode though, it runs more like 40 watts, down from 50 watts constant in turbo, meaning the performance is definitely more limited. In R23, you're looking at a fair bit behind even most of the last gen chips from both Intel and AMD, at least the 8 cores anyway. Blender rendering in turbo is actually pretty fast as well, only being beaten out by that 12700H in the ZenBook. The performance mode drops positions pretty considerably though, landing much more midfield. The Gooseberry render is much the same, impressive performance in the turbo mode, and a decent showing in its performance mode as well. In Premiere Pro, using Puget Bench, it actually doesn't do all that well here. The actual user experience for editing was relatively lackluster too, and After Effects, it doesn't fare all that much better, netting the same kind of towards the back of the pack performance. Only in Photoshop do we get a healthy result. Not the fastest I've seen, but still perfectly decent. I did try running some of these tests with the XG Mobile connected as well, and that did improve the scores somewhat, although I had a few issues with that I'll talk more about in a second. Of course, this thing is meant to be a gaming machine, so how does it game? Well, I ran the benchmarks on both the RTX 3050 Ti DGPU and the RTX 3080 laptop eGPU, so let's start with Shadow of the Tomb Raider. The 3050 Ti nets just over 54 FPS on high settings at the screen's 1200p resolution, which is perfectly reasonable, with the 3080 netting 99 FPS on the same settings. Cyberpunk netted 45 FPS average on the 3050 Ti on medium settings, with the 3080 at just shy of 110 FPS average. Microsoft Flight Simulator, again on medium settings, hit over 80 FPS average on the 3080, which I think is a first for my testing, while the 3050 Ti nets near on exactly half that at 41.5 average. Finally, in Fortnite, the 3080 storms ahead with 242 FPS average on high settings, while the 3050 Ti is a more modest 81 FPS average. Now, I would normally include data from games like Watch Dogs Legion and CSGO, but as was pretty common in my usage of the Z13 and the XG Mobile, both games just refused to run, seemingly for different reasons. CSGO supposedly failed to create a D3D device on either GPU, regardless of any settings that I tried, and Watch Dogs Legion would launch, but got stuck on a black screen and just stopped responding. The only way to close it was through Task Manager, so that was a no-go as well. I also had strange performance results, like in Cyberpunk, where despite the XG Mobile supposedly being a hot plug device, you do have to activate and deactivate it, but it shouldn't require a Windows restart to work just fine. I was getting iGPU levels of performance until I reboot it. I should note that this setup does contain a MUX switch, or a multiplexer, which is great. It's one of the more top-end options and should give you better performance, but that hasn't stopped it from, well, causing issues here. It's also worth noting, since we're talking about the XG Mobile, that the connector for it is absolutely massive, and also a massive pain. Especially since it connects to the tablet and not the keyboard, the angle that it sits at makes it very easy to stress that connection, and I could imagine that it wouldn't take that much to have it just snap clean off. I can't imagine that this connector needs to be this size. Like, could we make it a little bit smaller? Maybe make it so that it's less likely to want to sort of snap itself off instead? Because that would be nice. Now, speaking of the display, this model is the 1920 by 1200 120Hz IPS panel option, which sounds great on paper, but in practice is mediocre at best. It covers 100% or around that of the sRGB spectrum with relatively good accuracy. That's okay, could be better for sure, but still fine. It runs at just shy of 500 nits in SDR, but my god, the response times are terrible. The panel clearly lacks any overdrive modes or profiles, meaning that it runs a dreadful average of over 20 milliseconds for any given transition. That is really bad, especially for a gaming display. Anything under, say, 5 milliseconds I would generally call pretty good. Anything under 10 is what I'd call sort of passable, but over 20? That's just not a display you want to game on. That's translated into the high-speed footage of the UFO test, where you can see just how many ghosted frames are on screen at once. That's, what, 4 frames? At 120 Hz, a new frame is drawn every 8.3 milliseconds, so 4 of those works out to about 33 milliseconds sort of on average here, which seems about right. You can also see that the black pupil of the little alien never gets rendered, and the white of the eyes barely shows up even right as a new frame is ready to be drawn. That's how slow this panel is. The actual gaming experience is definitely a weird one. With the XG Mobile connected, you, generally speaking, get good performance. I mean, except when you don't, but still. And the display, well, it's pretty noticeable how slow it is to render new frames. The fact that all of the heat is in the display and not under your hands is a nice quirk, although anytime you go to reposition the thing or touch the very nice touchscreen, you'll, especially while gaming or just after gaming, you'll be met with some nice burned hands because the entire chassis, especially on the metal on the back, gets painfully hot. On the whole then, this is a rather strange machine. I'm not quite sure who this is for, since it doesn't really excel in any one area. As a tech demo, I think it's really interesting. For Asus to cram this much sort of power and performance into something this small, into literally a tablet, is incredibly impressive. But as an actual machine that you should go and spend £3,000 of your own money on, at least for this plus the XG Mobile, especially when the Flow X13, the foldable version, is currently just $2,200 for the same XG 3080, but a more standard foldable chassis with a 6th gen Ryzen CPU instead. I would definitely rather spend my money on that instead if I was in this market at all. With that said, those are my thoughts. I would love to hear yours in the comments down below. What do you think of the Flow Z or Z13 and the XG Mobile? What do you think about its sort of quirks, if you like, and features, I suppose? Feel free to let me know in the comments down below. I will leave a link to it in the description down below. That'll be a global Amazon affiliate link you can check out sort of when and where you watch this, because things like pricing can and does vary. There'll also be, of course, the subscribe button if you want to stay up to date on all of these new videos, or you can check out and support the channel through a load of different ways, like the YouTube join button, where you get access to both our Money Mid Discord chat and some cool rewards like sponsor-free videos, or you can support on Patreon instead if you'd prefer. There's also a load of other affiliate links to places like Overclock UK if you're buying from there. There's merch hoodies or t-shirts like this one. That's all linked in the description below. And of course you can check out some more videos on the end cards if you want to keep watching. Maybe take a look at the ZenBook Pro Duo or Pro 14 Duo laptop I checked out recently. Otherwise, that's kind of it. If you have any questions, feel free to leave those in the comments down below. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.